passages in Difficult Freedom that relate to Abraham in order to characterize Levinas's Abraham. I will demonstrate how Levinas's understanding of Abraham in his Jewish writings is relevant for what he writes in his philosophical writings. In his entire oeuvre, Levinas discusses the meaning of the Abrahamic adventure, once in the language of Jerusalem, once in that of Athens. Levinas invited, so to say, Yafet in the tents of Shem. He also invited Shem in the tents of Yafet. In the Religions for Adults, which first appeared in the 75, Levinas brings the apologue about Abraham, the son of a seller of idols. Abraham broke his father's idols, but Terach himself was not so dull as to believe that the God could be responsible for this. From the episode, it follows that, I quote, monotheism marks a break with a certain conception of the sacred. It neither unifies nor hierarchizes the numerous and numinous gods. Instead, it denies them. As regards the divine, which they incarnate, it is merely atheism. End of quotation. Levinas thus perceives Abraham as a prototypical religious person who does not have a naive faith. He is not violently transported beyond his powers. The sacred does not envelop him. He is not participating in the drama beyond this world. Abraham is rather someone whose relationship with God implies freedom and education, rather than participation in the noumen. He destroys the concept of the sacred. Levinas goes on claiming that Judaism in this sense is close to philosophy and to the exercise of intelligence. The human being is independent, able to understand intelligible reality. This entails the risk of atheism, but this risk must be run and finally overcome. An adult faith implies in Levinas's view that one denies God as a sacred power overwhelming the human being, and that one affirms him after death. Atheism or non-theism was better than the glamour of myth and enthusiasm. In this passage, Abraham is presented as the first, one could say the first iconoclast. He is refusing to be transported by ecstasy. He thus becomes the father of an adult, disenchanted, demystified religion in which a divine word goes together with an independent human intellect trying to understand this world. Abraham testifies to an absolute transcendence. He perceives in this world a trace of a transcendence that is never present. He bears witness to a laity which is never there. Abraham denies that God is an image. This denial is necessary for him. As we will see in the next passage of Difficult Freedom, he recognizes the divine word in the face of the other. The second passage on Abraham in Difficult Freedom is to be found in a beautiful short article on Heidegger, Gagarin and us, published first in 1961. Levinas deems that Judaism has always been free in regard to places. The land is a holy land that spews forth the unjust. Biblical descriptions of nature are rare. Nevertheless, in Genesis, it says, Vayita Eshel in this city, Beersheba. Explaining the passage, Levinas urges the reader to be careful and not too quickly jump to conclusions. The Talmud explains that Tamarisk Eshel is an acronym, or notarikon. It stands for food, drink, and shelter. The sages were not fascinated by the mystery of nature. They mythologized nature, freed it from a spell. Like technology, Judaism, Levinas concludes, demystifies the universe. It discovers man in the nudity of the face. In the article in the scroll, Heidegger's Weltanschauung of the human being as living in the place, being there, being enrooted, is contrasted with technology that frees from the Heideggerian world and the superstitions surrounding the place. For Levinas, Judaism is a distance towards nature. It joins Socrates, who preferred the town where one meets people to the countryside, landscapes and trees. Levinas perceives Abraham not as enrooted in a familiar fatherland, but as exiled from himself following a call. In Genesis, Abraham hears God speaking to him, the divine call deracinates Abraham and makes him a stranger to himself. His land is not the land where he was born, or the land of which he is the first inhabitant. It is a promised one. His dwelling in it is justified through his turn to the other. He dwells in a land, that has no mysteries in it. It merely satisfies the basic needs of man. In Non Propre, Levinas again discusses the special Jewish relationship to the land. Apropos Paul Celan, he writes that in the turn towards the other, one finds his genuine fatherland. This fatherland is not linked to birth or first of occupation. The dwelling justified through the movement towards the other is defined as of Jewish essence. On the background of these considerations, Abraham belongs to a land that is always promised, a land that vomits unjust inhabitants. He is called to create a community of mankind. He follows the call of the one who wants the good beyond being. He becomes unique in his relationships to others. With Abraham, the infinite comes into the finite existence, le plus dans le moi. He is now in exile from himself, not enrooted in his own autarky, where everything is conquered, dominated, and possessed. He is projected outside himself towards the other. Abraham leaves his own country, he becomes landless, not to return to what is known. After many encounters, Odysseus in the Odyssey returned to his native land, dissimulated under false exteriors. Abraham, in contrast, has no father or motherland. He is in contact with real exteriority that demands justice and catapults himself outside of the known into the adventure of a life in humble service of the other. A third reference to Abraham and difficult freedom can be found on the last page of Levinas' essay on Rosenzweig, called Between Two Worlds, which was originally a speech in '95. Levinas praises Rosenzweig's approach of the Jewish calendar as expressing the Jewish spirit and Jewish eternal life. Rosenzweig indeed developed the notion of the ritual year, in which the eternal people, Amolam, anticipates eternity in the circularity of the year cycle. For Levinas, as for Rosenzweig, time, lived in this way, is not only as valuable as the time of history, it is anterior to that time. In order to make his point, Levinas refers to the Midrash, in which Hagar and Ishmael, chased away by Abraham, wander in the desert. The water supply has run dry. Yet, God helps Hagar to spot a well and gives water to her dying son. At that moment, the angels protest. Why is God giving water to someone who will cause suffering to Israel? Yet, God answers that the end of history does not matter. He judges each person for who he is now, not for what he will become. Although this passage does not relate directly to Abraham, but to his wife Hagar and his son Ishmael, it is relevant for Levinas' view on Abraham. For Levinas, Judaism, of which Abraham is the father, consists in fracturing the totality of history. History itself does not prove nothing. What counts is that at any moment, history is right to be judged. This is the Messianic dimension in what Levinas calls, in the introduction of Totality and Infinity, the eschatology of peace. Abraham, responding to God's voice and saying, Hineni, starts a kind of history in which one stays under the judgment anachronistically. Jews, for Levinas, are foreigners to the course of history and to the world. Abraham was therefore not only independent vis-à-vis places, but also vis-à-vis history. He started Toldot, the humanized history of relationships. He breaks with any historical necessity with the concept of a deterministic history, of a history that judges human acts. A messianic being, Abraham follows a divine word beyond being, beyond history. In the fourth instance, in Difficult Freedom, Levinas continues to discuss Abraham's existence. This time, he refers to Bernard Bourgeois' book on Hegel that appeared in 1970. Bourgeois describes Hegelian thought, in which history with its religions and civilizations, states and wars, is a revelation of reason within being. In Hegel's system, Judaism and Christianity are stages along the way to the universal. They contribute to the definite truth and include outmoded aspects. Yet, Levinas notes, whereas Hegel's discourse on Christians does not hurt the Christian, his discourse on the Jews is, I quote, translated by a whole doctrine that corroborates the argument that up to the present day has nurtured anti-Semitism. End of quotation. For Hegel, the Judaic spirit was the negation of the spirit. Abraham's foundation of the Jewish people was an act of separation. Levinas quotes Bourgeois. I quote now Levinas saying about Bourgeois, Abraham's existence is therefore that of a being who separates himself from nature as the object of love and fixes it as the object of need. This is Bourgeois speaking. The Jew is not attached to an idea, but to an animal existence. In a word, both Abraham and Judaism at bottom involve a fall back into bestiality, end of quotation. For Bourgeois, I quote it again, Abraham's existence was completely dominated by an exclusive concern for his own preservation, his own security in the midst of natural vicissitudes. Abraham, a thinking animal, thinks precisely like an animal. All this is Bourgeois. Levinas notices that Hitler's propaganda drew heavily on Hegel's story, which, I quote Levinas, without adopting the slightest distance from it, a high-class French university lecturer, Bernard Bourgeois, opens up for us again in 1970, end of quotation. Levinas's criticism is biting. Does Bourgeois not know that Jewish ideas are incorporated, perhaps, in Christianity, suppressed and preserved, perhaps, in Hegelianism? And does Judaism not remain, certainly, a spirituality or a reason for living, and in any case the cause of death for millions in the 20th century? At the end of his article, Levinas demands if Hegel's system can absorb the prophets. In fact, Levinas' entire oeuvre points to the relevance of the wisdom of Jerusalem for the wisdom of Athens. If one loves wisdom, one shall not show his back to the wisdom of love coming from Jerusalem. Jean-François Rey rightly remarks that Abraham escapes Hegel's master-slave dialectic. Judaism is not to be caught in a Hegelian system. It is outside any system. It ruptures the system. Hegel could not think about the Jewish chosenness in a positive way. It was necessarily a separation, a particular contrasted to the universal. Rey maintains that Hegel forgot the real history of Toldot, the promise of the future, the dimension of responsibility and otherness inherent in the Jewish idea of chosenness. For Levinas, the other ruptures the system. Rey, similar to Goldstein-Goren, deems that what Hegel called the tragedy of the Jewish people is in fact the tragedy of the state that in name of the universal repress the particular. For Levinas, there is not only the Greek love of wisdom, there is also the Jerusalem wisdom of love, the source of wisdom that Greece cannot exclude. Judaism cannot be neutralized in a system. Levinas protests Hegel's assumption that Judaism is not at the level of universalism. The Jewish cohesion was affirmed throughout the centuries by a feeling of being involved in all the great affairs of the world. By a feeling, I quote, of being from the moment of the world's creation responsible for responsibility and its sense of justice, in the image of Abraham, interceding on behalf of Sodom. It is not of a predilection for even numbers that when rabbinic apologue suggests that the tomb of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob should also preserve the bones of Adam. Far from being in contrast to universality, Abraham appears to be a kind of particularity of which universalism is in need. He is chosen to be responsible for others and as such relevant for today. Levinas asks, I quote, whether the apparent and so-called non-thought representations of the Bible do not hold more possibilities than a philosophy that rationalizes them, but cannot let them go free. Whether the meaning does not stem from the scriptures that renew it, whether absolute thought is capable of encompassing Moses and the prophets, that is to say, whether we should not leave the system, even if we do so by moving backwards through the very door by which Hegel thinks we enter it. I just demonstrated that Levinas's Abraham is at the antipode of Hegel's Abraham. Abraham's Hineni, which ruptures totality, is further opposed to Heidegger's Dasein, which becomes clear from the article Heidegger, Gagarin and We that we already analyzed. In Carnet de Captivité, Levinas wrote, partir du Dasein ou partir du judaïsme. For Heidegger, the Dasein is the being, das ist in seinem Sein das Sein selbst geht. Perseverance en lettres. His Dasein, here's the call of the being. For Levinas, this call is not transcendent enough. Abraham answers the call of God, who is not contaminated by being, beyond being. He is witness of infinity. Whereas Heidegger persevered in the Greek logos that sheds light upon the being, Levinas was sensible for the Abrahamic word of honor hineni, that responds to the other au-delà de l'être, beyond being. Bringing Hebrew into Greek, Levinas did not see the distinction between the human being and being itself as the main difference. The main difference was rather between the same and the other, who is not to be assimilated. God as the only other is absolutely exterior and as such ruptures the totality of the being and of Abraham's self. God cannot be grasped or comprehended in a totalizing unity. This discovery was Abraham's. It was not a disclosure, but a revelation. Abraham was sensible for a word that precedes every logos. He was open for a limor that had to be said in vayedaber, although every vayedaber could never fully render the pre-original limor. In désintéressement and non-indifférence, Abraham follows a voice that cannot be reduced to what is. Abraham is not a man with projects that he realizes in absolute freedom, as is the case with Heidegger's Geworfenheit. For him, ethics is prior to being. He is not a Dasein that participates in design. He is subjected with transubstantiation, to use a Christian term, which Levinas uses, of his being. He is not existent, as in Heidegger, but in touch with the ineffable, and with a call that never can be fully answered. With Abraham, justice comes before freedom. He does not reflect the being. He is under the judgment of the Father, who urges genuine brother and sisterhood. In the Abrahamic perspective, language does not first of all discover the being, It is primarily response to the call, Hineni. Called by God, Abraham is not anymore enclosed in the cavern of himself, but open to a transcendence that is beyond being, with an impossibility of escaping the call. Abraham, from Levinas' perspective, was first of all a prophetic figure, bearing witness he was the other in the same. Prophets, Levinas explains, had no choice. He refers to Ezekiel, who was taken by the air. The saying, "Here I am," in the accusative, bears witness to the infinite. Levinas further explains that the one self is prior to self-coinciding. He remarks that Hineni does not mention God. Hineni signifies me, in the name of God, at the service of man that look at me without having anything to identify myself with, but the sound of my voice or the figure of my gesture, the saying itself. This recurrence is quite the opposite of return upon oneself, self-consciousness. It is sincerity, a fusion of oneself, extraditing of the self to the neighbor. Witness is humility and admission. It is made before all theology. It is kerugma and prayer, glorification and recognition, and of quotation. The word Hineni makes Abraham a witness in humble service of others ad majorem Dei gloria. Levinas' protest against Western philosophers whose philosophy remained an egology allergic to the other was thus inspired by Abraham. The biblical figure of Abraham became a correction of the figure of Gigas, who sees everything without being seen. Abraham knows himself as being looked upon by others, as being called. He corrects Adam, who still thinks that he has a place of refuge where God cannot reach him. He corrects Cain, whose saying, Ashomerach Anochi, is countered by the saying, Hineni. Abraham, the answering being, corrects Noah, who did not plead for the survival of others in the flood. He responds to the call of God, Ayeka, and so he opens the dimension of infinity, an infinity or exteriority that cannot be neutralized in human existence. Abraham finally serves Levinas as a protest against Hegel's Abraham and Heidegger's enrooted Dasein. In this manner, he translates Hebrew into Greek. He brings the ancient text in a modern context. He brings Hebrew wisdom within the Greek conceptual academic discourse. Ladies and gentlemen, although my lecture deals with the passage or the passages on Abraham in difficult freedom, I want to mention one other passage, an Abraham passage outside of difficult freedom, because of its crucial importance for Levinas' understanding of the first Jew. In proper names, no proper, Levinas reminds his reader public of the binding of Isaac that belongs to the Abraham side, in order to react to Kierkegaard's presentation of Abraham. Whereas Kierkegaard reads the binding of Isaac as the sacrifice of Isaac in the framework of his teleological suspension of the ethical, Levinas highlights the non-sacrifice of Isaac as the culmination point of the biblical history. The test was not to obey God. The test was an ethical one. The angel's words, Al tishlach et yadcha el hana'ar, translates, so to say, Abraham's respect of the faith of Isaac, even against God's will. In Levinas' reading, it is astonishing that Abraham obeyed to the first voice, since the essential of the story would lay in Abraham's distance of his obedience in hearing the second voice. Levinas' Abraham is the one who intervenes for Sodom and Gomorrah, in contrast to Kierkegaard's Abraham, who receives his violent singularity in surpassing the ethical. The Akedah is not about Abraham's duty to obey God. It is about attention to the potential victim. Claire Elise Katz has well remarked that the shift is from the voice of God to the face of Isaac, from Abraham's hearing to his seeing. She further remarks that for Levinas to be ethical is to be in contact with God, and that ethics makes man unique, whereas for Kierkegaard, the ethical is understood in terms of the universal and religiosity as transcending ethics. As in Bohr's account of the Akedah, not to carry out the sacrifice is for Levinas the religious culmination point in the story. He reads the entire Abraham cycle as a response to the faith. Abraham is in an ethical relation, which is not a corollary of the vision of God, it is that very vision. In Difficult Freedom, Levinas was interested in bringing those passages on Abraham in the Bible and the literature of the sages, which could forge an alternative for Heidegger's talk on being enrooted in places, and for Hegel's not less problematic thoughts on the relationship between the biblical Abraham and universalism. Abraham brought the beyond in the human existence. He is not identical to himself. He is related to God. His openness to what is above is palpable in his hospitality, extended towards three visitors that come into his tent. The passage, I think, not commented upon by Levinas. Abraham becomes a stranger to himself, not coinciding with himself. He is beyond identity. He is otherness in himself as a result of openness to the needs of other human beings. He is exceptional in that he is related to what is beyond being. Anti-totalitarian, because he does not limit himself to what is. In this manner, Abraham becomes the prototype of the anti-totalitarian man who protested in the 20th century against brown and red totalitarianism. Abraham represents heterogeneity within a homogeneous society. His life is around the ineffable and indescribable. Consequently, his existence is particular and universal at the same time, since all mankind is destined to recognize what is above a closed, immanent existence. He links the infinite to the finite world. Land and posterity are not possessions, they are promised, meaning dependent upon the relationship with infinity. Natural life is changed as the result of the acceptance of an irreducible alterity. Catherine Charrier, in her Judaisme et Altérité, writes that Abraham has to leave any place which is his own. He has to go, lech lecha, not as Lot, who goes because he needs to go in order to safeguard his future. Abraham answers to a voice that deprives him from any possession and makes him into a responding being without setting something apart for the future. The voice he hears and obeys demands everything. He leaves everything familiar in order to establish the religious bound as the relationship between the same and the other without totality. Significantly, the wife of Lot, says Catherine, returns to what she knows, to her preceding situation. She has no name. But Abraham was called by his name and became irreplaceable in his attention to the other. Levinas, in his Jewish writings, as in his philosophy, renounces the eternal return to the same in order to go to the other. Abraham is the prototype of the one who had to leave everything that links him to the sameness in order to go once and for all, lech lecha, to the other, in désintéressement and dépossession. To conclude, that Levinas's philosophy, as love of wisdom, learned from the biblical wisdom of love, expressed in the texts of the Abraham cycle. Levinas's rationality bears the traces of a deeper wisdom, which as a source of wisdom had to be taken into account by philosophy. Athens was not opposed to Jerusalem, as in Judah Levi, Pascal, for that matter, Hegel. Abrahamism and Atticism, Hellenism, were not contrasted as in Exatos thought. The Jewish spirit and the Greek spirit were different, but connected. The meaning of the Hebrew was important for Greek. As Maimonides, Levinas thought that Judaism and philosophy were compatible. In my Levinas's Jewish thought, I maintain that in his philosophy, as in his Jewish works, Levinas considers revelation as a rupture of totality. In his philosophy that wanted to take distance from a thought that did not prevent violence and polemos. He was influenced by the best of the Jewish tradition, which pays attention to the other and its transcendence. Abraham's code, so to say, influenced Levinas, who in his ethical hermeneutics links Jerusalem to Athens. His Jewish writings contain philosophical considerations, and at the same time the traces of the divine word are palpable in the logos of his philosophy. Living in the Greek culture, Levinas at the same time spoke Hebrew, which he found eminently present in the Jewish writings. His bilingual oeuvre became possible because of two reasons. First, Levinas deemed that the Greek logos, so to say, grew out of the biblical world. In other words, the word of engagement was a condition for the Greek with its knowledge, justice, and state. Greek was recommended and even required by the Bible itself. Second, Levinas maintained that Judaism's core was universal, ethical, and therefore, I quote, to teach Greek culture to speak Hebrew is to remind everyone of something that they already are, but of which they are unaware. So to say, everybody is Jewish in this consideration. In his account of Abraham, Levinas interpreted Abraham as an exemplary ethical being, suspicious of spontaneity, of crucial importance for the Hebrew as well as for the Greek world, in the biblical revelation as well as in the philosophical discussion. In fact, what is true for Abraham is also true for Israel as such, which for Levinas, first of all, is an ethical category. Abraham and Israel are commanded against their will, called to be responsive of a normative word. They are demanded to extend hospitality, kabbalat panim, to be in proximity, to be the unique one for the other. In Levinas' perspective, also Israel is ready to respond prior to cognition with na'aseh v'nishma. What is called revelation in the religious language is congruent with the Cartesian idea of the infinite. Ethics is the content of both. In the Bible, Abraham's contact with God, his experience of the revelation, takes place in the ethical contact with the other human being. Philosophically phrased, the face of the other ruptures the totality of the self. Abraham thus belongs to the Hebrew world that requires a Greek translation. In this sense, Levinas presents Abraham paradigmatically as Avinu, our father. Thank you.